I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining for this 3 o'clock politics and news show. I'm excited to welcome my next guest. He has been here before, Dr. Terrence Roehrig at the Naval War College, expert on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Kate.
Well, there has certainly been a lot since we've spoken last, and there's a lot been taking place this week as well. But I want to probably go through maybe from a time frame standpoint as to everything that's transpired, both between North and South Korea, and now what we see looking forward with President Trump slated to meet Kim Jong-un on June 12th in Singapore. So let's talk a little bit about the lead up to this historic peace brokerage between the North and South. And let's talk specifically, a lot of chatter about the role that President Trump has played, but you really know the inside players, you know the situational awareness. How was this made possible, and how much of a role did President Trump have or not have?
Sure. Let me start with the history that you suggest is important here. South Korea had a special election in May of 2017, so just about coming up on a year now of the South Korean President Moon Jae-in in office. And he campaigned on a pro-engagement policy with the North Koreans. And he was the front runner in this election from the get-go. And so we had a good idea this is what we were going to be getting. And so when he was elected, he reached out to the North Koreans almost immediately. But the North Koreans didn't appear to be very interested. He was greeted with more missile tests, another nuclear test. And so there seemed to be very little opportunity for his pro-engagement strategy to work. And so there was a good deal of harmony between Washington and Seoul on their North Korea policy. Fast forward to New Year's Day, when the North Korean leader traditionally gives a New Year's address that outlines, it's sort of their version of a State of the Union. And Kim Jong-un said very clearly, offering an olive branch to South Korea, indicating that he might be willing to participate in the Olympic Games. And lo and behold, South Korea has their opening. They follow up. We have several meetings that follow. The North Koreans send a delegation to the Olympic Games. They march in together under a single unification flag. They host a joint women's hockey team. Several more meetings after that, and we have the announcements that there will first be a South Korean, North Korean meeting at the DMZ, then the big surprise that there would be a U.S. North Korea summit meeting. And then snuck in between all of that, the North Koreans and the Chinese decide to mend their fences and have a meeting as well. And so, my gosh, we have summits breaking out all over, and it looks like peace is going to be on the Korean Peninsula. But I would caution your viewers that they manage their expectations. While this is all good, and I am absolutely supportive of dialogue to try to reduce tensions and bring some greater degree of peace and stability to the peninsula, particularly where we were several months ago, we are a long way from getting to a denuclearized North Korea. To the second part of your question, what role did Trump play? There is some debate about this, but I think it is very plausible to argue that the sanctions and the tougher policy that the United States had towards North Korea had some degree of impact in bringing the North Koreans back to the table. But there's also an argument to be made that this has been part of Kim's strategy all along in developing his capability, getting it to this point, and he was planning to come back to the table regardless. So the short answer is we really don't know for sure, but I think it's plausible again to argue that these pieces had a role to play.
Is that a lot of the speculation as to really sort of the psychological motivations of Kim Jong-un and trying to question his motivations? I'm sure lots of folks are looking at him as he is, again, moving forward in the international sphere. You know, is he an honest broker? Does he have underlying motives? Is that just something that outsiders might not be able to ever figure out?
Sure, and I think that is another piece to this that there is a good deal of debate and uncertainty about. There are many who argue that past North Korean behavior would make one skeptical to believe that the North Korean regime would necessarily come to any agreement that would be acceptable for the United States and South Korea, and then the second piece to that, actually follow through on that. But on the other hand, folks argue that there is a possibility Kim Jong-un has a new view on some of these things. Perhaps he has some different goals and willingness to approach some things differently. My own personal view on that is that I am skeptical, but I think, again, that these talks are absolutely essential to explore these possibilities. We don't know if we don't sit down with the North Koreans, talk about these issues, see what they truly are willing to do, what is achievable, but certainly to go in with our eyes wide open to make sure that we negotiate as tough as they are going to and be prepared to see where this takes us, but again, with a very realistic mindset.
Let's talk a little bit about the prisoner release and the reaction and the implications in the international community.
Sure. It certainly is good news for these three individuals, for their families. To get them back home is a great news story, and the administration deserves credit for that. It also is, I think, a positive sign from North Korea that they were willing to release these prisoners, to be able to make a gesture of good faith moving into the negotiations. But it's also important to remember that these poor individuals were detained on pretty questionable circumstances. They have become political bargaining chips and shouldn't have been held in the first place. And so, take it with a grain of salt. But again, I think the alternative of North Korea holding them certainly was not a very good thing. And so, again, I think an important gesture, but one that needs to be considered in the broader context. Plus, important to remember that there are a number of South Koreans that are still being held, and Japan has never fully been able to receive an accounting of well over a dozen Japanese citizens who were abducted in the late 70s, early 80s by North Korean agents.
Okay.
And some have been returned, but Japan has never gotten a full accounting of these abductees, and that's another piece to this issue.
So let's talk about this planned meeting for June 12th in Singapore. Was that on your short list of possible places that this summit could take place?
It was on my short list, but I have to say, if I were a betting man, I'd have lost $20 on this arrangement, as my money was on the DMZ. But the story is that while Trump favored that initially, and it would have been the same venue that the North and South had their meetings at, he was cautioned that the optics of that would have been problematic. It would have looked a little bit too much like Trump was going to Kim Jong-un's turf. And so Singapore was viewed as much more of sort of a neutral ground between the United States and North Korea. North Korea also has normal relations with Singapore. They have an embassy and an ambassador there. Kim demonstrated in his meeting another surprise where he showed up in China early this week, that he was willing to fly someplace, which his father was not willing to fly and would only take trains somewhere. A train trip to Singapore would have been a long trip if he would have insisted on that. So again, when you put all that together, I think Kim was willing to be a little more flexible, because just being able to sit down with a U.S. president, the optics of that are going to be absolutely huge for Kim Jong-un. And so I gather to think that he was probably willing to be a little more flexible, and Singapore was a reasonable middle ground for the United States and North Korea. And lo and behold, that's where we're going to be.
So we've discussed this before when it was just in the preliminary possibility stage as to what a summit would look like between the president and Kim Jong-un. And one of the things that you had mentioned in previous interviews is that a lot gets hammered out, as a lot does in the political sphere, sort of at that staff level before the two come to that meeting as to those last things to really hammer out. How big are these delegations when we talk about a meeting between the president and Kim Jong-un? I mean, how many folks are going to be at the hotel?
I'm not sure. It hasn't been announced yet, and not clear how many people are going to be there. So that remains to be seen. But certainly who goes is going to matter. One of the key pieces that is always raised about the United States side is we still don't have a number of key people in the appointed positions that you would have expected to have gone along with the president. For example, an ambassador in place to South Korea. We had a position of a special representative for talks to North Korea. That position has not been filled. So, there is some question about those positions, but certainly there are others who will take those spots, at least in the short term, to support Secretary of State Pompeo and the president going into these meetings. But you're right about how this could play out. Typically, an agreement that is going to no doubt be very detailed would have had a lot of lower level staff meetings and dialogue, setting up the details, working out a lot of those pieces, and then the leaders go in and sign the final document. And that has not been the case. But of course, folks could argue it hasn't worked well in that direction in the past. So why not try this to perhaps break some of the log jams that we have seen up to this point? But we shall see. Certainly, you have the elements of watching the technical evolution of this meeting, but also certainly just on a personal level. Do the leaders get along? Do they have some sort of personal connection? It certainly has been important for President Trump in past summit meetings with other leaders, but that is going to be equally important here. How do they get along? Are those kinds of personal relations going to be conducive to moving on to the more detailed technical pieces? But certainly a lot of things to hammer out and a lot of details to work out if we can even get to a final denuclearization agreement.
And so we have a date set on the calendar talking about being a betting man. Could there be circumstances? Could anything derail this between here and there?
I think it's unlikely at this point. Certainly it's possible. And if you follow the evolution of this, when it was first announced that there was a possibility, I dare say if Vegas had any odds on some of this, it may have been a lot longer odds that the meeting was going to happen at all. And at a point there, I was perhaps 50-50, depending on all of this. But now it looks like it's very likely that it's going to happen. And I think one of the key pieces to this is that the United States and South Korea have insisted that denuclearization is the central element to this. Kim Jong-un has talked the talk about denuclearization, and I think understands that if that is not front and center, the goal, then this meeting probably would not happen. And so he has talked very much about denuclearization and his willingness to do this. But once they sit down and we start getting into the details, here is where the question comes in. Do they have the same understanding of what denuclearization means? And we shall see. But again, I think Kim Jong-un is going to be very flexible in making sure he says the right things about denuclearization to make sure he gets this meeting. Now, again, I am absolutely supportive of us pursuing this and seeing where this could go. But again, I remain skeptical that in the end we can get to denuclearization, but we have to keep trying. Diplomacy is much better than where we were a couple of months ago. Military options would be a disaster.
Okay, I've got to ask you the million-dollar question. President Trump has been tossed around as a potential name for a Nobel Peace Prize. Is he deserving of a Nobel Peace Prize?
Wow, that's a tough one. And I do have to remind you that I work for the government.
Are you going to recruit? Are you recusing yourself?
Well, that's just a hard question to answer. I think it's very difficult at this point to say whether that's going to be the case. Certainly, again, I think that he has done a number of things that have changed the narrative, changed the direction of where we are headed here. But there is a good deal of debate as to whether North Korea has acted in this way because of President Trump's policy, or that this has been North Korea policy all along. But we shall see.
We shall see. I appreciate your taking the time to Skype in and give us your perspective, Professor. We'll keep an eye on that meeting scheduled again for June 12th. Hopefully we'll have the ability to get you back on and parse what we have heard coming out of Singapore. Professor Terrence Roehrig, I appreciate your taking the time to Skype in.
Thanks, Kate. Happy to be there again.
Have a great weekend. We'll talk soon.
Okay. You too. Bye-bye.
Okay. Want to thank Professor Terrence Roehrig at the Naval War College, Skyping in, talking about the latest with North Korea. South Korea, and the United States. And I appreciate all our viewers watching this afternoon here at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We'll be back on Monday with Business Monday and more. But in the meantime, read GoLocalProv.com and check us out on Facebook. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.